Hello and welcome to another episode of Gender Stories. As always, I'm elated to be here with another fabulous guest. And today I'm here with Miah Jeffra, who's the author of the Fabulous Ekphrastic Fantastic, the Violence Almanac, the chapbook, The First Church of What's Happening, and co-editor with Arisa White and Monique Mero of the anthology Home is Where You Queer Your Heart. Awards include the new Millennium Prize, the Sidney Lanier Fiction Prize, the Atticus Review Creative Nonfiction Prize, the Alice Judson Hayes Fellowship, Lambda Literary Fellowship, and 2019 finalist for the Lambda Literary Award for Outstanding Anthology. Whew, I managed to get all those awards in a row. Lots of awards. And Miah's latest book, also American Gospel, which is what we're going to talk about. And for those of you who are on YouTube, you get to see the beautiful, haunting cover as well of the book. And Miah's most recent work can also be seen in StoryQuarterly, Prairie Schooner, the North American Review, The Pinch, the Greensboro Review, Diagram, Jubilat, and Barrelhouse. Miah is a founding editor of Whiting Award-winning queer literary collaborative Foglifter Press and teaches writing and anti-racist studies at Santa Clara University. So welcome and thank you for making time for Gender Stories today. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so let's get right into it. And I don't want to give readers spoilers, of course, of your latest book, American Gospel, and already shown that, like I said, the haunting cover, I think. But there are lots of really wonderful themes, I think, in your book around home, grief, transformation, place. And so I guess I'm wondering, what do you hope the readers will get from your latest book? Like, what's the feeling or message that you're hoping to communicate to readers in your latest book?
Well, I encoded some messages that I think I was discovering as I wrote the book. And, I definitely have certain feelings about some of the issues in the novel, particularly the way that real estate is managed in America, how it perpetuates class disparity, how we relegate certain spaces of poverty to coincide with spaces of violence and depravity, despite the fact that the people who live there, are 100% flesh and blood, with hopes and dreams and flaws and virtues like everyone else. But we discard them because we have almost this kind of moral relationship to wealth. And so that certainly was encoded. Whether the readers get that or not, of course, is up to them. But it's also, I hope that readers get that there is redemption in the not only the challenges of being a woman, being a queer teenager, but there's also redemptions in being someone who had no interest in social justice really, and then it ignites because they're faced with it. So maybe ultimately the message I would like readers to get is that we all are capable of awful and wonderful things. I think maybe ultimately at the end of the day that and urban renewal is a bad idea.
I love all of that. I was like, ooh, my brain is going into 3 different directions. I kind of want to talk about urban renewal in the US and gentrification and what it does to different cities and different neighborhoods, but also and we can definitely go there in a moment, but I want to pause for a little bit longer on this idea of characters that are fully human, right? That are capable of beauty and connection and love and also violence and awful things, right? Just like any human. And that's one of the things I really loved actually in the book. I think that's the thing I love the most is just how human your characters are in a lot of ways and how kind of in a way, anti-white supremacy, that is, right? Their characters are not aspirational. They're not like two-dimensional. They are kind of fully human, which means they're fully flawed as well as fully beautiful, right? And in some ways that almost feels countercultural sometimes at the moment in writing. I don't know if you felt like that when you were writing, because there is almost this push to package everything nowadays into kind of neat boxes, and that's what I loved about your book, that actually wasn't that way. Am I making sense? I don't know if that resonates with you at all.
Yes, and thank you. And I'm glad you picked up on that. I have no interest in characters being representatives of a
Yes,
particular virtue or vice. None of us are entirely evil, none of us are entirely good. And that's what makes us gorgeous. And it's very, very important to me that all characters get the service of the light and the dark within them, and that we can relate to that because we are that way.
absolutely. And I think that that pressure of representation can be turned up so high, I think, for minoritized characters and or writers or both, right? In terms of like, oh, there's so much pushback. Oh, this queer character is flawed, or it's not fully representative of everything, or why are we don't want to represent queer characters in certain ways. And I wonder if you struggle with that at all when you were writing the book, if you felt this pressure, especially now that there is also so much social media input, noise, whatever we want to call it. Definitely as a writer, I notice the difference as somebody who's old and over 50 of like, what's it like to write before a lot of social media and with a lot of social media noise about what writing should be about and what queer representation should be about.
Yes, I mean, this is a very, very important part of my writing practice, to render queer characters so that they are not one or two dimensional. We've had so much literature written where the queer characters are, drug addicts or prostitutes, have suicidal ideation, um, are stylish confidants to lovelorn women, what have you, these archetypes. And I don't oppose those representations because some of it is relevant, but a lot of times, especially for presumed straight audiences, the queer character needs to be a unicorn.
Yeah.
It needs to be a victim, or it needs to be, this kind of bright, shiny fairy,
Mhm.
what have you, right? It becomes a stock character that somehow is used in contrast to the straight character. And
Mhm.
I definitely am not interested in that. For example, Peter in the novel is a queer teenager, and I didn't want him struggling with his sexuality. I didn't want his story to be a coming out story.
Mhm.
And I I asked myself, what kind of queer teenage representation could be terrific in complicating the landscape for potential queer readers?
Mhm.
And that's when I decided that he was going to be a sexually confident
Mhm.
individual. He was going to be sexually active. Um, he wasn't going to be concerned about that aspect. He was just going to be looking for love and,
Mhm.
in all the wrong places, like most of us do. But, not to be this cowering, simpering um, victim of, his burgeoning queerness. He owns it.
Yes.
And I think that could be nice. That could be nice for queer readers now.
Absolutely. I love that about Peter. And also because there are so many young people where that is much more similar to where they're at rather than maybe the more kind of I'm really struggling or I'm not very confident, right? It's like you said, that is just one portrayal. Right? As somebody who works with young people, I definitely had that moment of like, yes, Peter is a character that we don't see very often, but that does represent some of the folks in our community, if that makes sense. And so I really did love that about this character in particular. And there are so many stories that you could have picked, right? So many different stories, so many different representation. What was it about Peter in particular, or any of the other characters that kind of called to you? Because there's kind of, yes, I'm just curious about like the choice of the central characters, so to speak.
Sure.
Without, it's always hard to talk about a book without spoiling it for people who haven't read it. But let's see what we can do here.
Sure. I mean, there's three central characters to the
Yeah.
novel, all written in their perspectives woven throughout and the structure. And Peter being one of them, this queer teenager who lives in the neighborhood that is
Mhm.
scheduled for demolition. Um, his mother, Ruth Ann, who is estranged from her husband, and then this religious cleric in the Catholic Church, Thomas. The the choice of the characters vary. Firstly, Ruth Ann is a redemption song for my own mother. Um, Ruth Ann is not my mother at
Mhm.
all, but my mother did go through domestic violence, and it was pretty severe to the point where it impeded her social mobility as well as her economic mobility and mostly her emotional growth. And I always wanted to give my mother a redemption story. So this fictionalized account, um, that's where the novel truly began. Um, Peter comes in as kind of like a fantasy version of what I wish I could have been,
Mm.
right? What I aspired, I was unfortunately that kid that struggled with the shame of their queerness, and I wanted to see a young person not. I wanted them to not possess shame
Mhm.
and to be concerned about other things, because how wonderful would that be? And the cleric, Thomas, is it's a larger kind of social commentary about Baltimore, which has a very Catholic tradition to it.
Yes. Mhm.
And the Catholic Church has not been very mobilized in defending and championing for those who are struggling most. They definitely have outreach programs, but they don't work to protect spaces and housing. Um, and after my research about Baltimore and the kind of gentrification issues, the being one of the leaders of the community, the Catholic Church, I wanted to give I wanted to give one of the members that agency to become what I feel Baltimore needs, which is more of an activated Catholic Church because it is so influential. Um, and so Thomas represents that.
And I love that because it's also rare, I think, in my experience, and maybe I'm reading the wrong books, but to find two characters like Peter and Thomas in the same novel, right? To find like and yet something else I loved about your book. Oh, and again, I feel like I could go in so many different directions. I do want to talk about Baltimore and place because place is very important in this book. But I want to kind of step back for a moment to what the beautiful things that you said about the character of Rufan, right? That redemption song. I think that's one of the, as somebody who has survived domestic violence both as a child and then as a young adult, that definitely it was hard to read the book at times, and it was also amazing to read the book. At the same time because I thought it was just really insightfully written. Again, I'm kind of walking the line of not giving readers any spoilers, but there was a lot of insight there, and I love that you talked about this being like a kind of a redemption song in some ways, right? Of that impact and that intergenerational impact as well that domestic violence can have, right? Unless there's really active engagement in breaking that cycle, because often domestic violence, in my experience, goes back generations. And I don't know, yeah, and I see you nodding, so I was wondering if any of that resonates for you, that kind of intergenerational thread as well.
Absolutely. Uh, we see that in families. I can speak personally that did exist in my mother's family. She broke that tradition.
Good.
Good for her. But very much, it passes on almost like a genetic predisposition.
Mm-hmm.
And that, coupled with poverty, especially the very particular brand of urban American poverty,
Yes.
those it's like a perfect storm that perpetuates that intergenerational struggle and trauma. And so it makes sense that we see that in this neighborhood, vis-a-vis Ruth Ann.
hmm
Mhm.
And let's talk about gender as well, because right, there's class, there's socioeconomics, there's place, and there's also gender dynamic often, right? And the gender dynamic can also be complex, right? There is not just necessarily, women are more likely to experience domestic violence, because I think also in queer community there's often a lot of intimate partner violence because there's a lot of trauma, and people are trying to relate to each other, having not always having worked through their trauma, or not having the tools, or not having the even just the capacity, just uh, through trying to survive under capitalism. And so, yeah, let's talk about gender in the novel, or even just generally in your writing, if you like, and kind of how it intersects with all of those themes that we've been talking about so far.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, right. It's like, where do you begin? Just an easy question.
Yeah. I mean, all my books talk discuss gender, explore gender. Um, my my nonfiction explores it very explicitly. The Fabulous Ekphrastic Fantastic has a thread of gender identity throughout. I identify as non-binary, and that term wasn't even in my purview. When I was in college, where I was already demonstrating that kind of sensibility, and when I discovered that term, one, I love anything that pushes against binary oppositions first, right? Uh, I like I like spectrum oriented um, identities and dispositions overall. So conceptually, I thought it was a very valuable term, but personally, I was able to inhabit that, and it liberated me, not just from trying to adopt a cis sensibility and presentation in my own life, but that it wasn't even about being cis or not being cis.
Yes.
It was, I'm going to assert various aspects of my identity on that spectrum that now I feel like I have permission to do in an interesting way, right? There's sadly labels are part of our day to day, and even us non-binary folks we feel this propensity to apply a label because
Yes.
that to be more legible to the outside world. And what I love about non-binariness, gender fluid, um, are the fact that we constantly change. And my essays, my nonfiction really explores that. Um, my short fiction even has characters that are all along those gender lines without explanation. That's very important to me as well, that they just live in the world because they are human beings. And
Yeah.
we don't need to explain their quote unquote difference because that others them. And I'm very uninterested in exploring otherness. I want to kind of shatter it by having the readers just accept exactly these human beings who happen to have gender fluidity in some way. So I have trans characters, I have what appear to be cis characters, and then everything in between.
And I love that too, because I'm always like, well, like, how do you draw the line between like where does trans end and cis begins and non-binary ends and something else begins, right? It's like it's such a those lines are so artificial in some ways, right? And that's a lot of my work. It's definitely focused on kind of on that, and how gender liberation is really for the benefit of everyone, right? And then often people are kind of looking for permission to be expansive, or they react so in ways that are so policing and constrictive because they feel so policed and constricted themselves, not to be too kind to folks who are transphobic or queerphobic, but there is definitely an element of like restriction and constriction, I think, in that kind of gender policing that can go on. And so I love that you're like, I don't need to explain those characters. I'm like, absolutely. People can just exist.
And you mentioned gender policing.
Yeah.
I Where I'm most concerned about that is actually not with the cishet community.
Yes.
It's within the queer community. The fact that the queer community performs that kind of gender policing is really upsetting to me.
Yeah.
Because we should be the ones that are, perpetuating this liberation that eventually also affects cishet folks, because honestly, no one is. No one is fully cishet. I
Exactly.
really believe that deep in my heart. And if we can somehow be the kind of the avenue for that liberation for everybody, then we're going to have a much more peaceable world, right? Because we start shattering these notions of like, I must fit in this box. I must fit in this box, right? We all need to get rid of that.
Absolutely. 100%. The heart of the multiverse is queer. I truly believe that. I don't think it was an accident that even as a young teenager, when I had no idea about queerness or gender, I didn't have a language yet in the early 80s for any of that, early 80s in Italy. But for example, I knew that like certain kind of like even geopolitical borders, I were like, geopolitical borders are fake and wrong. And people are like, you're young and like, you'll change your mind. You'll see that's not abolitionism. It's not a practical stance when it comes to geopolitical borders. I'm like, 52, I've not changed my mind. And in fact, let's abolish even more borders. Let's abolish even more things, right? Let's like, it was like, if anything else, I think that my desire to kind of break down some of those borders and barriers has only become more intense rather than less intense as I've gotten older.
I
And I
love
think
that.
there's a queerness to that, right? It's about queering kind of our dominant understanding that have been imposed on us in through so many different systems of oppression, I think.
Alex, I truly believe that if we want to eradicate the notion of borders politically, we have to start spiritually. And
Yes.
that an identity is where it begins, right? That that body world relationship. I mean, our political systems and typologies that we have created has everything to do with the way that we identify ourselves. So if we begin to transform that, I really feel like that could have a reverberation that moves way beyond the personal and into, the political, the social, even the economic. I really do believe that. I don't know if we're just optimistic, but I prefer to be in that space.
I don't know about that. I have been called the relentless optimist by my oldest child, and she's always like, "You're a relentless optimist," and it's great. And sometimes it's a little much, and I was like, "Okay, I can hear that feedback." I was like,
I'd
"That's
rather be a
fair."
little much.
It's like me too. I was like, I am a little much. I'm kind of the older I get it, the more I own. I'm like, I am a little much, and that's okay. But I love what you said about having to start spiritually and from identity, because even us separating ourselves so much from nature because of the impact of colonialism, for example, that, seeing ourselves as separate, don't even get me started on the doctrine of discovery. And now I think that's also connected to how we view gender. Anyway, I've written about it. I don't have to go on about it during your interview, but let's talk about relationship to place as well as gender, right? Because place is like it's almost like Baltimore is another main character in your novel too. And also I don't know if that's your experience, but my experience is also that my gender and my queerness changes from place to place, right? The way that I feel like I can express it, like in my country of origin, in Italy, it's different. And it's even different if I'm in Rome, where I was brought up, or in Sicily, where I spent a lot of time, more rural. In Minnesota, it's different in the Twin Cities. They might be in rural areas. When I travel again, I feel almost like a chameleon sometimes, depending on where I'm traveling. And so I'm curious about the relationship to place and gender, and that, and I see you nodding. So hopefully I'm making some sense in my ramblings.
Absolutely. First off, it really resonates with me what you were saying earlier. Your interest in kind of colonial structures, the doctrine of discovery, this kind of Judeo-Christian Islamic kind of brand of colonialism that is, this assertion, this domination of nature,
Yes.
removing us from the biocentric relationship that we,
Yes.
also have. The Judeo-Christian Islamic structure is anthropocentric. It
Yeah.
puts human beings at the top of the chain, which of course creates an arrogance, right?
Yeah.
And we see that in capitalism, we see it in colonialization, right? And I would by no means suggest what is the right way to be, because I've existed entirely within this construct, even though I feel intuitively to push against it because it removes us too far from our nature. So, with that, I just want to acknowledge that I love that you're doing that great work. That's amazing. And it relates to why place becomes character in my novels, because
Yes.
a city, a place is a combination of human beings and nature. And we are nature. And we create these agglomerations that are kind of like a macrocosmic entity, like a human being. They are
Mm-hmm.
beings and they operate like beings. Their complexity, their structures, naturally, because we created them, and they're
Yes.
extensions of us. So yeah, there's there's no doubt why we we even gender cities and states, and right, we kind of personify them. We think of Boston as kind of a masculine city. We think of San Francisco as a very feminine city, right?
Mm-hmm.
New York is masculine, right? And then there's variations within that. I feel that our our propensity to personify extends itself into the way that I render place. I do feel like it is indeed a character. I don't know. Did I answer all your questions? I feel like I left something out.
I don't know. We'll figure it out. We'll probably circle back to it again. But I am curious about why Baltimore for American gospel. Like why Baltimore specifically? I mean, yes, like I can guess from reading your book, but I'm interested in your motivation for choosing Baltimore as the place character, let's call them. Yeah.
Yeah. Baltimore is one, I have a connection to it. I did spend my high school years in Baltimore. Um, even though I did not conceive of this novel in Baltimore, it was actually observing living in Los Angeles and this kind of overhauling of spaces. I was blown away by how Los Angeles erases space and history and rebuilds, and then erases it again and rebuilds. And there there was something so unique about that. I wouldn't say it's bad or good, but the negative aspects of it are they're constantly engaging in an urban renewal that relegates its residents. Like it just tosses them into almost a diaspora, despite the fact that they are still in Los Angeles. They just LA moves people around, and usually at their detriment. I think of things like Chavez Ravine,
Yeah.
to build Dodger Stadium, just ousted an entire dynamic community. Um, and many cities do it, of course. But it was my observations in Los Angeles and the gross erasure that that city engages in that made me look back on my time, living in low income Baltimore and seeing a city that is obsessed with its history so much that it doesn't move forward. So it's almost like an antithesis to Los Angeles.
Yes. Hmm.
So I wanted to place the phenomenon that I observed in LA into Baltimore to make it more of an American story. And Baltimore in particular has really struggled since the industrial dying, that occurred. The Rust Belt
Yeah.
diminishing, and they never got their footing, even though cities around them did, like New York and
Hmm.
Pittsburgh, right? They definitely have more of a story like Detroit or
Yes.
Memphis,
Hmm.
or St. Louis. So my affinity for the city already and my knowledge of the city, knowing its streets, um, made me think it was a good place to set the book. And it's also a very forgotten city. It's kind of in the
Yes.
shadow of New York and DC,
And DC.
right?
Yeah. Hmm.
So I thought it'd be, because I love the city so deeply, I thought it'd be great to render that character because it's not written about very much in literature.
That makes a lot of sense. And I love this beautiful fusion of personal experience and knowledge of Baltimore and place and what's happening in LA and kind of almost bringing it together. And let's talk about this idea of urban renewal, which is so American, I would say. I mean, I am an American now, actually, as of last year. It took 15 years and I have the citizenship. So I can't say anymore like Americans, like there's somebody else. I was like, oh no, I can vote now. I'm a citizen. So, but this idea of urban renewal is so fascinating to me, right? Because it's actually not a renewal. It's a distraction. It's a distraction of communities, a distraction of relationship, like you said, like and further marginalizing often those that have the least resources, and yet it gets branded as renewal. And that's why I think it's very North American, I should say, actually, because I feel like in North America, there's a lot of rebranding that happens, right? It's like the, uh, I don't want to get too political. No, who am I kidding? I'm always political on this podcast. But it's like pro-life people. It's like, this is not pro-life. I was like, right? It's like an urban renewal, right? Like, let's make it sound nice and like it's positive while we're actually taking something away. Does that make sense? And so, yeah.
Absolutely. Urban renewal is governmental racial control.
Yes, that's a beautiful
And
definition. Hmm.
I mean, if you look at the urban renewal projects that existed across the United States, what was deemed, this is a movement that really gets going in the late 30s, but
Hmm.
mostly in the 50s and into the 60s and 70s, as we know. It almost always was Black and brown communities, despite the fact that there were poor white communities as well. But it was almost always Black and brown communities that they deemed slums. And the association to slum had to do less with the quality of housing and the way the neighborhoods looked or operated. It had more to do with this relativity of property value in America. Mm-hmm. The fact that we speculate real estate the way we do, and how it still is so racialized. Oh, yeah. The fact that people who are Black or brown living in a community can actually reduce the speculated value of a home even today, 2023, is asinine. And it still is a reality. We put valuation based on perception. So urban renewal is taking that to this scope grand level and again erasing community, relocating and kind of dissipating any sense of kind of core identity. That's what its effort was to do that. I'm sure that someone rationalized and maybe even believed that the urban renewal projects in the latter half of the 20th century were trying to do good. But I think there was also very clear intent to racially dominate through a government program, very similar to redlining, which was happening in these neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. and very, I mean, there's no surprise that a lot of the red line neighborhoods were the ones that eventually became targets for urban renewal. So it just made it easy to control Black and brown folks, and in particular Black folks. Mm-hmm. And very much Baltimore being, a Black majority city, it was subject to that.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the pieces, right? It's like calling it the perpetuation of racial segregation is not going to be real popular. But hey, if we call it urban renewal, then we're putting this positive spin. And that to me does feel like it's this legacy of colonialism, right? It's this legacy of anti-Blackness. It's this legacy that it's kind of getting repackaged. And I totally believe that some people might buy the repackaging of it as something positive and renewing, right? Refreshing and redeeming, but actually behind it, it's this long legacy of colonialism, of anti-Blackness, of racial segregation that I think still deeply impacts I think every city in the U.S. I know my experience in South Minneapolis was definitely, you could almost tell, like if you mapped like the redlining, those maps onto what was happening, even in terms of gentrification, where fiber internet goes or doesn't go, right? House prices, all of that, you can see it. It's so clear. And yet it's almost like the smokes and mirrors, right? Which then, and there's so much more to say. And I think that's one of the things that writing can do sometimes is kind of open up the curtains a little bit or try to clear the smoke and mirror. And I think that that is one of the themes in the book too, right? It's like really kind of, let's open this up a little bit more and let's kind of see what's behind the curtain, or whichever metaphor we want to use. I'm mixing my metaphor between curtains and smoke mirrors, but you know what I'm trying to say here.
Very much, yes.
I'm very bad at mixing my metaphors, so forgive me. Yeah, I feel like I could have this conversation for a long time, and I was like, Alex, look at your questions because I want to be respectful of your time. But I feel like there are so many more conversations that I could have about any of the topics that we kind of opened up more. But is there anything, one of the questions I always ask towards the end of interviews is there anything we haven't talked about yet that you were hoping we would talk about in this conversation?
Wow, that's such an interesting question to ask. I feel I'm in this moment, this kind of impasse with my writing, because a lot of my work, all four of my previous books have been so focused on creating complicated characters that exist around issues that I think a lot of readers feel they are above. For example, in the Violence Almanac, all of the characters that are in these stories are both recipients and perpetrators of violence. And I think a lot of times, especially a reader, they feel that they are more enlightened, to the degree that they are above, the degradation of being violent, that they somehow have been exonerated because of their education or the choices that they've made. And I have always been very interested in demonstrating multidimensional characters, but also to indict the reader and to remind them that they are capable of just as devastating choices and actions as anyone that they would vilify on social media.
Absolutely.
That we can all be pushed into a place of reprehensible behavior. And so that was what I have been doing so much, either examining my own reprehensible behavior or creating fictionalized characters that surprise you with theirs. But I need to take a break from that. It was very
that's
difficult.
hard work. Yeah.
Yeah, it was very difficult to write the Almanac. It was very difficult to write American Gospel. Even though hopefully we see some glimmers of hope and redemption in there. But now I'm working on a story very consciously that conveys queer joy. I'm wanting to write about two young boys who may or may not be queer. They're 12 years old, and it's just about a deep, soulful friendship that they possess. And I'm leaving it ambiguous, what their sexual identity is, largely because I'm tired of those identifiers, right? And just trying to recreate and capture how soulful we are, even as a 12-year-old, how romantic we can be, how full of tenderness we are, and how we become socialized, especially within contemporary American masculinity, to begin to lose that tenderness, to somehow conform. But I'm focusing on the beauty of it. So I hope that you would read that story, because I feel like I'm exploring gender in a more pure way, in a less political way, in a more spiritual way. And I'm excited to finish that novel.
That's beautiful. I'm excited for you to finish that novel so I can read it. Absolute 100%. I think, sometimes when I look at like younger people or children, like just the way that they can express things is so different than adults. And so I also love that those characters are 12 that you're writing, right? When I look back and I think about just the pure, like I didn't know anything about queerness and there wasn't anything sexual, but just the pure kind of friendships and closeness. I remember like as a teenager getting this what I realize it was a love poem from a neighbor when it was the same gender as me at the time. That's the best way I can put it. We had the same gender assigned at birth, let's put it that way. And, but I didn't see it as sexual at the time, right? Or anything to do with sexuality. It was just this expression of pure friendship and closeness and admiration and connection, right? And I think that we need so much more of that in the world.
I do too.
Yeah.
I think we need more romance. And
Yes.
the romance doesn't need to be relegated to a sexual partner.
Yes.
We can be romantic with so many people, and I think we have that inherently in us, and it gets buffed out
Mhm.
by what is considered proper and acceptable, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm all about like being just loving and romantic with with your friends and but also with your community. I have so much love for my communities, right? And I think I love that you mentioned hope. Actually, I was going to talk to you about hope and then I forgot because we were talking about so many other beautiful things. But maybe that's a good place to kind of end on, which is like, I love that you feel called to tell this different story and focus on queer joy. And I think there is hope in American gospel as well. And Mm, but how do you find hope and joy in your own life in this particular moment, which feels really hard to a lot of people in a lot of different ways? And so I've been asking a lot actually in the last couple of months to all of my guests, like, how are you finding hope and joy and connection in your life at the moment?
Okay. I think that's twofold. So I've laid the groundwork. In case I get lost, you can say there was a second thing, Maya. First off, I'm a teacher, uh, and I teach creative writing and decolonial studies, and I love teaching. I love facilitating a classroom. I love learning from my students. I love that engagement. It's full of joy and love. We want to be there. We love sharing the space with one another. And I mean, I can't say anything about teaching that even remotely gets close to negative. I love what I do for a living. I'm so grateful for that. And the students keep me abreast about where they are and the way they operate in the world. So I don't get siloed in my own age and experience because the students constantly come and go. And, I'm working with them and I'm seeing the changes in the perspective, you know, that's local, but maybe also reflects more of a national kind of trend, right? And I learned so much from that. It keeps me open. So that's one way. I have a lot of hope with that. Um, I think the other way I cultivate joy and hope is despite some of these, I mean, terrible happenings around the world. And I mean, I don't even need to list them. We know them and they weigh on us so much. But I think they weigh on us, Alex, because we are actually moving in the right direction. I really believe that humanity is beginning to get exhausted by its own um, colonial tendency and the harm and the violence and the degradation that we exact upon one another. I think we have a long way to go, but we're getting closer to it, which is why we feel the despair so much more. We have always been a warring culture. I
Yeah.
mean, I'll just speak for America and maybe the West by
Mhm.
extension. We have always been a warring culture. There has always been conflict and violence. But we used to, as a as a society, we endorsed it more.
Yeah.
And I feel like we just don't as much anymore. There are exceptions to that, but I think generally, if we really pull back and look, more and more people are tired of it, that the violence is not worth whatever resourceful gain that we get or nationalistic need, quote unquote need. I feel like that exhaustion is actually a compassion that is emerging. And I do believe, probably not in our lifetime, but I do believe that we are finally going to get to a place where we understand that equity is going to create peace. And people will be willing to sacrifice their goddamn picket fences so that we can coexist. I do believe that we're moving in that direction with a lot of hiccups along the way.
It's never easy, right? That I felt pretty teary when you talked about exhaustion being the sign of emerging compassion. I think I really needed to hear that because this year has been so exhausting. And all I hear from people, whether it's clients, whether it's supervisees, as a therapist, I supervise a lot of younger clinicians, is the exhaustion. But I love that framing and that reframing, as we would say in therapy world, of exhaustion as emerging compassion. And I agree. I think that people are more tired than they used to be of violence and power over. Mm-hmm.
I think we have to believe that anyway if we are going to progress into a more kind and compassionate society, right? We have to. If we just revel in the despair, we'll give up. And then we're certainly not making changes, right?
Yeah, my friend Donald Engstrom Rees always says that, with most of us can't afford despair. Despair is just for the bourgeois, and most of us cannot afford to despair. And so we have to embrace joy and queer joy and connection. And so I love that we are ending on this note of exhaustion as emerging compassion. It's so beautiful. Like I said, I could keep having this conversation, but I want to be respectful of your time. And maybe we'll just have to have another conversation about queer joy when your new book comes out. I would love that. I love repeat guests. So just planting that seed. But if people for now want to find American Gospel or your other writing, where should they find your work?
You could go to local bookstores. But if you got to do it in the internet way, go to bookshop.org. It is basically the Amazon for independent bookstores, and it puts money back into the bookstore's hands. Stay away from Amazon.
I love ending on the anti-capitalist message. Yes, go to bookshop.org. You can even pick like your local independent bookstore or whichever independent bookstore you want in the country. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a UK version too, because I know I've got some listeners in the UK. So bookshop.org, I think there's both a US and a UK store, I believe. So absolutely stay away from Amazon. Do you have a website or any social media that you want to put out there?
Sure. It's not a very good one, but it's there. It's www.miahjeffra.com.
That's great. I will make sure that's also all in the episode description. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation about so many things. I feel like we could have kept talking for 4 hours. Maybe it's just me, but I will not do that to you or the listeners. So I look forward to talking more about queer joy next time, maybe. And thank you so much for being on Gender Stories today, Miah. So appreciate that.
Thank you, Alex. You made my afternoon.
Oh, that's great. And to you, Gender Stories listeners, as always, my immense gratitude for listening to our podcast or watching it on YouTube. Now that some of the episodes are on YouTube as well. And please let me know what you would like to listen to in 2024. I'm getting ready for the next season. So if you want, drop me an email and let me know who you'd like me to interview or which topics you'd like me to cover. Until next time, I hope you can find some ways to embrace joy and compassion. And